And I think I went home. Well, we're going to just talk about the series. We're going to do some review of what we've talked about already to kind of build upon that, and just to talk a little bit today about raised beds, a little bit about companion gardening, and additional soil amendments, something called biochar. That's something that's being utilized by some growers to retain nutrients. You know, so just remembering back, we want to talk about knowing our soils, and this off the photograph is a Addersall soil, which is a typical soil here in Marshall County. So just a quick review. We've already talked about this. Our parent material is the starting point, then organisms, climate, topography, and time will create soil, and it takes a lot of time to create 1 inch of good soil. We need fertilizer plants with carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, iron, manganese, copper, zinc, potassium, molybdenum, nickel, palladium, calcium, boron, and magnesium. So these are essential nutrients, and some come from air, water. The soil or organic matter can be a good source, and just minerals in our soils. But we need to provide these. Off the photo here is my hemp photo of nutrient deficient hemp, because the fertilizer wasn't managed properly that season due to rainfall that reduced the nitrogen available to a crop that needs nitrogen to grow productively. We know if we're short on essential nutrients by monitoring our soil nutrient level using soil tests. That's going to give us percent organic matter available, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and calcium. It's the available portion that's in our soil. Our soil holding capacity, which is cation exchange capacity, pH, buffer pH, which is showing you if that soil is, if you can increase the pH easily in that soil. It's kind of showing you how high the pH, how open that soil is to change in pH. So we gotta be careful not to get the pH too high. Our holding capacity of the soil for potassium, magnesium, calcium, and hydrogen ions. That's called base saturation or cation saturation. And other nutrients on request we can look at is sulfur, zinc, manganese, which is a problem in Marshall County, iron, calcium, and boron. The issue with the micronutrient tests is they're not as accurate as the macronutrient tests. So it's an indicator, not necessarily a clear direction on fertilization. That's why observing our plants for micronutrient deficiencies is valuable as well, but we don't want to see deficiencies. And that's why doing plant tissue analysis in some production systems makes sense, like hydroponics. Excuse me for one moment. I gotta drink some beverage or I'm gonna keep coughing. I wasn't prepared. This is a magical cup. If you put hot water in it, you can see pictures. That's from Penny Purdue. So looking at, we have to remember soil chemistry, and the soil test gives us indication of where it is as far as in the cation exchange holding capacity. And remember, it's organic matter and calcium in our soil that gives us that holding capacity in our soil to hold on to nutrients, and water adheres to the soil. And then the pH is important because it needs to be in the right range for the plants that you're growing. Some plants like it acidic because they need more of the iron, manganese, and boron and copper, for example, to have productive growth. So they need a pH that's fairly acid. Most of our plants prefer it just slightly acid. Most plants do not like it above 7 pH, if we remember the discussion that I shared earlier. And soil structure is key for our productive soils. So we want them to have nice openings between the soil particles and the soil particles that adhere to each other to make a blocky structure or nice granular structure that will allow water and air into our soils. So it's important to remember that aspect of soil structure. We can destroy soil structure with compaction, creating platy structure that will not allow nutrients and water to flow through our soil easily, nor roots. So the characteristics of a good soil has got that good soil structure that allows water movement, good tilth for root growth, so it can grow deep into our soils. A corn plant, for example, can grow 4 feet deep into our soils if we have good soil structure. And it's important to allow proper exchange of soil gases as well. So the roots need access to oxygen just like we do, because roots are actually burning up nutrients to perform their function and survive. So they need access to oxygen and some moisture as well to take into the plant, allow the plants to be functional. But what's really exciting about soil, and remains, it's always good to have this discussion, is the organic matter is a key component to promote the health of the soil ecosystem. Our soil is alive and things growing in it, and we need to have the food and the proper environment to allow that to be a productive environment for the organisms to live in the soil. So we need that organic matter for promote good soil structure, nutrient and water holding capacity, and is essential for active and healthy soil life being many organisms. And we want these organisms to have a good environment, so we have productive organisms. But we have bacteria, fungi, and protozoa, nematodes, worms, insects, arthropods, and even reptiles and mammals. We don't like to have moles in our yards, but what they're actually doing is aerating the soil, allowing for water and air to get down in that soil. So out in an ecosystem, they do have a positive role. It's not so positive step into one of the runs in our yard and trip. But they do have benefits out in ecosystems. But fungi has an important function, helping with root health, to have the plants to be more resistant to disease and more productive in taking in nutrients. Bacteria, remember, there's multiple things it does, but also rhizobia bacteria can fix nitrogen with legumes. Are giving the bacteria energy. Talk about some soil amendments in addition to what we've already discussed, but the value of compost and manure and cover crops have a real impact on soil health and creating soils to be better than they were before we utilized them and incorporated them in. And Other note is that cover crops are capturing nutrients that may leach out of the soil if not for the roots of that cover crop growing when a crop is not growing actively in our soil. So cover crops not are only growing and adding organic matter to our system, they're capturing nutrients that would be lost from the system if it wasn't for the growth of those plants. We need to remember that in the spring of the year, our soils come to life and the microbes come to life and they start releasing nutrients in the spring of the year. So if we don't have anything actively growing in the soil, those initial nutrients released from the soil will be lost. So we're going to start more of some of the topics for today, managing for productive soils. Manure. Look at that pile of manure. It's a great source of organic matter. We discussed some of the issues with using manure, but compost and cover crops in addition to that manure are great sources. We're going to talk a little bit about compost tea, biochar, corn gluten, Epsom salts, gypsum, and then review mulches and the benefits of mulches today. Mulches are an important tool that we utilize throughout our landscapes, and we'll talk about that. But just remember, composting is nothing more than trying to accelerate a natural process by having the right size and mixture of nutrients so that we have the nitrogen to break down the carbon in the compost material that we're trying to decompose into a form that it makes a good soil amendment or even a good mulch. And we'll see some examples of that being done here in Marshall County. And remember that it's the particle size and the mixture of nitrogen to carbon that will determine how rapidly composting occurs. Biodiversity. You know, it can't be emphasized that by rotating crops within a site and adding cover crops to add some biodiversity, it aids in helping to build the soil organic matter. There's some grasses and legumes in here. Both the grasses will capture some of those nutrients that are escaping, and legumes will have higher nitrogen level than the grasses because, again, of that rhizobia bacteria that's allowing that plant to harvest nitrogen from the air that the rhizobia captures. So some soil amendments. Compost tea. Have either of you ever utilized compost tea? It's just that's great. Do you use it as a fertilizer or do you do any foliar treatments with it?
I just use it as a fertilizer. I have organic fertilizer, and then I put it in a bucket and water in there, and what does it smell? But my plants, whether it's vegetables or flowering plants, they love it. You put that on, and it's just like you're smiling.
So for those that may not have heard that, she has great success using compost tea as a fertilizer. And so it's a relatively simple process. It's just taking compost and placing it in a bucket of water to allow it to steep so the nutrients that are in the compost can get in that liquid form so we can use it as a liquid fertilizer. A recommendation is 5 parts water to 1 part compost. The quality of the compost will determine how nutrient dense the liquid will be that's resulting from the steeping process. The recommendation on what I was reading is 1 to 3 days. How long do you let yours steep?
If I need it right away, I'll let it steep for like a day, day and a half, and then I'll just let it sit in that bucket for as long as until I use it up.
Can
And
you
then
use it?
sometimes there's still granules in the bottom and then I just add more water.
And I visited an organic dairy system that used compost tea to fertilize their pasture, and they would just have a huge tank and have the compost in there and just take the fluid out of the tank. So it's steeping for a long time, you know, because they would just keep
I've
adding both.
seen them use that out in California at the farms.
Okay. So it's a great option that particularly for, you know, if you have indoor plants that you like, instead of adding compost on top of the container, you could be utilizing this compost tea to help supplement their nutrients. You have to remember that any containerized plant that we do grow, we'll probably talk about container growing here in a minute or two, that what we buy is potting soil, has osmocote in it, with fertilizer in it, and as soon as that osmocote releases all the fertilizer, that medium is going to be void of nutrients and we're going to need a supplement. So using something like compost tea would be a great option for that. Corn gluten has a relatively high nitrogen organic fertilizer. It's 10-0-0 roughly, and it adds some organic matter as well. But this is one of those organic herbicides we can use as a pre-emergent herbicide if we want to utilize it to add some nutrients around some plants. And if we use it at a high enough rate, it'll help reduce annual weeds from germinating. Always hear that people that grow tomatoes have to apply some Epsom salt. It's supplying a magnesium and sulfur, but we shouldn't be utilizing it unless it's needed for the plant's growth. So it's providing two key nutrients, both macronutrients, and they can be, depending on the soil and the history of that soil and how it was managed, or in a container, it could provide these two nutrients if needed. So it's an option that we can utilize to provide these nutrients. It does not, the article noted that it does not suppress blossom end rot because there's no calcium in Epsom salt. It can supply two macronutrients that may allow the plant to be more productive. Gypsum is a mineral that does not affect soil pH, which is important for Marshall County. If you remember our discussion of pH in Marshall County, our soils are kind of unique because we have some calcium base to our soils. So we can have soils at a pH that's near neutral, but the actual calcium level in the soil, upper soil profile may just be medium. So we may be concerned that we may have some calcium availability issues. So gypsum would be the right tool to use in Marshall County sometimes to provide some additional calcium without changing the soil pH. Because if it's already 6.5, we don't want to raise the soil pH if we want to add some calcium to make sure our plants are getting adequate calcium. Like with blossom end rot with tomatoes, usually if it's growing in a soil situation out in a garden, it's usually more of a moisture issue where the plant's not taking up enough calcium with water because it kind of flows in. Talk briefly how nutrients get in a plant, but this one can just move in with the water into the plant when it's being productive with a good, healthy root system taking in water. Sometimes we have weather that creates droughty periods that kind of shuts down that water intake, and that, even though the soil is adequate, can create a deficiency in the plant. And we see that happen. So sometimes, and usually actually with blossom end rot, it's more of a nutrient uptake issue by the plant than the medium being deficient. Biochar. So this is just something that we've been playing around with in the research community, and some growers are actually creating this. If you think about it, it is a relatively new soil amendment to add carbon into the soil system, and it improves nutrient and water retention of the soil, or that is our hope. Biochar is just charred organic matter. Usually it's wood. The picture you're seeing is actually a piece of biochar I got this week out at Ancilla, or the center of Donaldson's greenhouse. And the grower there creates biochar to break up and put into his compost piles. And that will charge the biochar to retain some of those nutrients and capture those nutrients. But we need to create this biochar by burning wood in a very low or absent oxygen environment, so it doesn't actually burn. It just changes at a high heat into this charcoal type product that has a lot of pores. So it's similar to charcoal that you could buy at the store, except that this has a lot of, it's very porous and light once it goes through this process, so it can uptake with these pores nutrients. So he charges his by putting in the compost pile before he utilizes it as a soil amendment. Research at Purdue would indicate that it does have more recorded benefits in soils that are lacking organic matter. So in a loamy sand soil, a soil that tends to have not a high cation exchange capacity, that's the environment tends to benefit plant production more than compared to a soil that's been well cared for and has a higher organic matter. So looking at mulches, it's a great tool to keep the temperature of the root zone at a moderate level. Encourages conservation of moisture, helps control weeds at 3 to 4 inches on well-drained soils. But if it's a poor drained soil, we don't want to put it as deep as that. We want to keep it at 2 to 3 inches. We want to remember that mulch is a barrier to water and gas exchange in the soil, so we don't want to make it too deep. We definitely don't want to do a practice that you see occasionally where they put it a foot around the trunk of the tree to make it easy for maintenance crews, not have to worry about weeds close to the tree and making sure that they don't mow up against the tree trunk. I'm kind of embarrassed to say that Purdue University used to mulch their trees on campus like that. Finally, the horticulture department got them educated to the point where they're mulching properly. So we don't want thick mulch, by the tree trunk, because we don't want to encourage advantageous roots growing out of the tree trunk into the mulch if it's up by it. I've seen that happen in situations where I've actually seen a tree trunk rot because they created a stone raised area, hard structure around the trunk, and filled it with a medium to grow flowers right by the tree. The problem is you're not allowing that bark to breathe. If you want to think about putting a mulch a foot by the side of a tree trunk, just imagine sitting in a bathtub for 48 hours. It wouldn't be good for our skin, nor is covering a tree trunk bark with mulch good for the health of that bark. It can help prevent soils from crusting, adds organic matter in the soil. It's allowing it, even non-organic mulches will help protect what's happening in that soil so that the organic matter is not being lost. Protects from soil erosion, which is critical. Soil erosion, of course, takes away an inch of soil that it took 500 years to create potentially, and also is taking away nutrients from the tree when erosion does occur. On hillsides, trees can be a very stabilizing force, but sometimes erosion will take soil away in those environments and the trees will not be able to maintain stability. So we want to protect our trees and our landscapes from having any erosion issues. Oh, the bottom one. I have had more homeowner calls about weed eater or mower blight. The trees die overnight, but when I get out there, there's only a little strip of bark that's functioning for the tree. And then in the hot summer, that little strip of bark can't keep up and the tree wilts. So damaging our bark is on our woody ornamentals is a quick way to end their life. So having mulch around them to remove the temptation of removing plants close by the trunk is a good thing. On woody ornamentals, where we talk about some rock mulch, we want to make sure we don't allow rock mulch if we use it by our woody ornamentals to be up against the trunk of the tree. I've actually seen them embedded into the trunk of the tree as the tree's girth grows, because it doesn't have growth to push those rocks away when they, particularly when they interlock. And I've seen trees almost choked to death due to that happening. So if we're using structures, options for mulches that we're going to talk about that are rocks, we want to make sure we don't have them up against the trunk. And that means even, we got to monitor that, because as our trees grow and the girth of the tree enlarges, they'll grow into the rocks, even if originally we had them pulled back from the base of that trunk. So looking at some mulches that are organic, grass clippings or fresh clippings may heat up, contain herbicides, and harbor pests. So like if you have weeds or in your lawn, and as you're mowing, it could be bringing some weed seeds with those grass clippings. If you applied a broadleaf herbicide in your lawns, and then you save grass clippings to be a mulch in your garden, that may be a very poor choice to make, because those herbicides will maintain the activity in the clippings and could impact the broadleaf plants in your garden space. In the garden space, the one issue is they break down rapidly because they're high in nitrogen. So it has to be a repeated process to give good weed control, but it will recycle those nutrients back into the soil in your garden. I have seen the heating up issue where someone piled a large amount of grass clippings around the base of a tree, and it caused the tree to drop its leaves during a growing season. Though fortunately, the tree rebounded once they moved that heat away from the base of the trunk. So the good thing is they kind of shocked the tree into a leaf drop situation, but fortunately for them, they didn't kill their tree. Sawdust can add nutrients to your soil, but we need to age it so it's not robbing needed nutrients from the soil to decompose. So it's something that if you have a source of sawdust that you like to use as a mulch, you should age it, let it start breaking down so it doesn't need as much nitrogen once it's placed into the garden or perennial flower bed environment, for example. Compost is a good way to, as we've already discussed, to add some nutrients and organic matter to mulch over an area. Gardening show I saw before he planted a new gardening bed, you always put on looks like an inch or two of compost before he planted into his beds, just to add that rich source of nutrients and organic matter, which will help that soil to keep its biology alive to make a healthier environment for the plants to grow in. Straw can be a problem if it's a weedy straw bale that you're getting straw from, but it's a great mulch for small fruits and vegetable gardens. You can hopefully see in this pile of straw how fluffy it is and allowing air to move through. So it's a good mulch because it can age and add organic matter. It can attract actually some beneficial insects. And talking about companion garden or gardening organically, one way we control the Colorado potato beetle is actually using BT, which is a natural bacteria that will limit the growth of the first stage of larvae of a Colorado potato beetle by not allowing them to digest food. but also straw mulch around potatoes will attract in beneficial insects that can help control that pest as well. The challenge with the Colorado potato beetle is if you even are a person that prefers to use our insecticides, which BT is an organic insecticide, many of them do not work because this insect has a very high ability to develop resistance to pesticides. So in this case, straw mulch, BT is as good of an option in controlling that insect pest of potatoes. There's probably many other options that we would tend to think of. So other organic mulches, traditional ones would be wood and bark chips, inexpensive, plentiful. As they break down and they'll decay more slowly than some other organic mulches, it will return some organic matter to the soil. So it can help build that as well. What we're seeing off to in the picture is actually shredded bark. So it's a good material, low maintenance, inexpensive, can help prevent weeds is one reason why we use mulches and protect that soil environment. Pine straw is good for acid-loving plants because they'll help acidify the soil. So if you're growing some plants that like acidic soil environments, then pine straw, pine needles can be a good option for a mulch to control that health of that soil and weeds in those plantings. Leaves, we want to reduce particle size and compost them first. A thick layer of leaves can obstruct water absorption and air movement into the soil if that process is not done. I've seen someone using leaves as a mulch with leaves that were not fully composted, and it actually created a thatching layer that was not good for the health of the soil environment. So a university research study simply collected leaves from a city and they reduced the particle size, composted them from over the winter, and then actually sold back that final product that didn't look like the leaves that they collected, but was compost back to the city residents, and they thoroughly enjoyed having that healthy soil amendment that they could use in their landscapes. So they were paid to take them, and then they sold them back to the same community. Sounds like a good profitable option. We can do this at home too, but we need to reduce the particle size of our leaves, ideally, before we try composting. Then looking at some inorganic options to help manage our beds to be more productive. Plastic film is good for weed control. We use that in a lot of vegetable production scenarios. We even use it in strawberry production to have a site that we can grow some vegetable crops and not having to deal with weeds close to the plant. And there's been research that different colors of plastics actually attract different types of insects. So for some crops, not using black, but a red could help attract in some beneficial insects. So there's different ways that we can utilize this tool in our landscapes, environments, and our beds. The one issue with putting down plastic, though, is it can trap moisture that cannot readily go through that plastic where it's solid. We'll make openings in that plastic to plant the plant into, but if it's in a perennial bed environment that we're keeping that plastic there, it could contribute to some root rots of the plants that we're growing in that plastic fabric. Geotexture type materials are designed to allow better air and water movement through that material. So that's going to help alleviate some of the concerns with using a solid fabric type product similar to plastic, but it breathes to help suppress some of our issues that can happen in our landscapes. So we can use like pea gravel, river rock, and larger rock primarily for decoration over a sheet of plastic or geotexture. We think it does do initially a good job of controlling weeds. But what tends to happen if you have rock mulches is over time, soil will grow in and settle in between the rocks and create an environment where some weeds can grow. They won't impact the growth of the plants that are in that bed, the shrubs or what have you. They can make the weeding option being something you have to do again down the road. It's just the nature of the situation. Crushed rock or gravel, will stay away from limestone, but it's a crushed rock can make a very nice mulch, again, over probably a geotextile type material or plastic. Why do we want to stay away from limestone, particularly if it's against the soil? It'll change the soil pH of the soil, so it'll raise the soil pH. So particularly if you have plants that like a more of a acidic environment growing in that bed, you want to be careful from using limestone as a mulch. Even limestone county roads, I noticed that happening in some landscapes, plants being impacted by a higher pH than they desire, that just from the blowing of the lime dust as cars travel over the limestone road. In situations where the soils need to be limed, it's something you could observe actually, because close to the road, the alfalfa crop looked healthier than out in the field, because in southern Indiana, where I used to live and work, their soils tend to be, I'm not sure naturally, but because of a coal plant being close to that county, the pHs just tend to be in the 5s. And alfalfa actually needs a pH again around 7. So just that limestone roads would reduce the lime close to the roads, but not out in the field where the dust settled out before it got to that point. So that's why we don't want to use limestone as a crushed rock material. Brick chips can be decorative, many colors, and again, is similar to crushed rock in how we would apply them into the landscape. So we probably would want to have a plastic or geotexture material for them to rest on versus just the soil. Could be just the soil. I mean, that's your option. I always say gardeners have got the options of making their own decisions, but we just give recommendations to help you guide you in the right direction. Here we're using that fabric again, that breathable fabric in a production system. So they're planting into it to reduce the need for weed control. These plants are being grown organically. So, and we know that in our vegetable gardens, it's hard to find herbicides to use anyways. So that's why inside of this greenhouse or out in a production field, a lot of times we'll use some kind of inorganic mulch in the growing season. You can see there's holes cut into the fabric to place the plant in to grow in. And the grower would want me to tell you that you see some shorter growing plants. That's because after years of building shallow raised beds, adding nutrients into the soil to correct an issue in this greenhouse, you had to till the soil under, and tilling those layers of more productive layers on top down into the less productive soil, he created some zones where they were, currently it's not as productive until he can rebuild his soil again utilizing compost. Good, that's a good point on organic production. I always say, we want to grow stuff organically, we got to do the soil building first and get that soil nutrient level build up, organic matter build up, so that we can be feeding nutrients to those plants that we're attempting or are growing, but don't have means to supplement with a more dense fertilizer program. I mean, compost tea is great, but it's not going to have the nutrient density to support plants in a poor soil environment, usually. It can help. So another way we can have productive soils is just raising our beds. A raised bed's going to have an initial benefit of improving our water drainage. So we have a site that tends to be susceptible to having water problems for the plants. A raised bed can be a good solution. I once had a lady come out and she was blaming her farmer husband for having herbicides come out of an adjacent field to kill her tomato plants, but it was a water drainage issue. I kind of think I helped save a marriage there because she was wanting me to blame the husband so that she can be proven right, and good for that relationship in that situation. It was a water drainage issue, and we had more rainfall than normal, in that season, and it showed up. And in most seasons it didn't, because we were probably needing water, not having excess water that saturated the soil where those plants were growing. It's a good way to get gardening earlier because it'll help warm up the soil by being raised in the landscape once the air temperature warms up. That's something to remember, that when we're gardening is that the air temperature and the soil temperature are two different things. So if we have a day where it warms up rapidly, the soil temperature isn't going to, because it has that uniform cooler temperature. So it just takes longer to warm up the soil temperature to have it to be where seeds can germinate and dry out so that you can do planting into that main soil. But by having a raised bed, as the air temperature is warm, being raised, and it will heat up quicker because it doesn't have a massive area holding that soil temperature down compared to a more uniform soil height area. So a large raised beds can be amended the soil to enhance the plant growth. We have soils that are really poor in drainage, and we've already talked about how we can improve the soils is by adding organic matter to the soil. But if we just do it right where we plant a plant, the poor draining soil will release water into that improved area. So how we address that is by doing a more of a shallow raised bed on a larger scale. So we're planting those plants that may prefer a better drainage, may prefer maybe a lower pH. You can amend that whole bed to be a lower pH, working in some peat moss, for example, and create a better environment for those plants to be planted into. So if we do it on a larger raised bed scenario, we can really change the environment we're planting our plants into. Can enhance time to have a functioning new bed with less work. Have you ever thought about that? You want a new flower bed. Well, the traditional option is to double dig. So you gotta get a shovel out and dig at the depth of the shovel once and put that soil to the side. Dig another depth of that soil length below that, and kind of help that soil to be loosened up so it'll be more ready to receive root growth into that bed that may have been compacted because it was an area that grass grew in and people walked across or played volleyball on, or what have you. So that's a recommendation to create a new flower bed. Or you could do option B. Put down some cardboard or several layers of paper to, if you will, suffocate the turf that's growing in that spot, and then create a raised bed above that cardboard for that current growing season. And then that will allow the plants to grow, develop roots into that new environment, and we'll be talking about what we could be using to create a raised bed here in a minute. And so that first growing season, the roots are growing down, hitting that cardboard barrier may not get through it that first season, so you need to water it more. The second season, when you use that bed, that cardboard will be decomposed. And then the plant, or if you plant perennial beds in the initial bed, those roots are getting down through that cardboard into the soil. So in a relatively quick period of time, we can do a raised bed. Rodale Garden's called a lasagna garden, where you're putting protective layers to create that raised bed for that plant to grow in that initial season. And as it breaks down, it'll be a good organic, nutritious bed for the plants to grow in long term. And we saved ourselves from double digging. I don't know how many of you out there would like to double dig. I do not. So it's a quick way to get a bed going. So that's something we can do with a raised bed as well. We can allow gardeners to have easier access by having a higher raised bed, so that as we lose some of our mobility, we don't have to be bending over or beyond our knees doing our gardening. So a raised bed is a good tool to help us to enjoy gardening, even as our mobility to do gardening starts to wane. So and there's many ways we can do raised beds for that purpose. We can allow gardening in hardscapes by using container gardenings on top of that hardscape, whether it's a raised bed or a container that we utilize. We can create soil to meet the needs of the plants that we're growing. So our soil may be poorly drained and fairly neutral in pH. We can create a soil that's better drained, higher organic matter, and grows massive living plants like blueberries. In Florida, they're growing blueberries, but they're actually creating raised beds of organic soils that meet the needs of that plant. So by doing a raised bed in that situation, a plant they couldn't grow in that area, by doing their created raised beds, they can even grow enough to be commercial in producing blueberries in the South. So that raised bed's obviously going to give us some good drainage. And for container gardens, we need to remember to give drainage holes at the bottom. We talk about that in containers, we can put like rocks or other items in the bottom to collect that water, but it's never a good scenario, because if you overwater, then the roots are going to be sitting in water. And they make actually some nice containers that has a reserve to recycle nutrients, but it's designed on how that one is put together to allow the plants to be more self-sufficient than most containers would be, where we have to water more often. But as a rule of thumb, we want drainage holes in the bottom of our containers, so excess water can drain out and the roots can stay in that nice wrung out type sponge environment that's moist but not wet. So I already mentioned containers as well can give us good access to the plants. I need to make the raised beds with proper widths in mind. 2 feet is the width we can reach in easily. So we have it's a raised bed by a structure. It only should be about 2 feet wide. But if it's a raised bed that we have access from both sides, 4 feet can be the width that will allow us access from both sides. But when we have multiple raised beds in one location, remember we have to work on both beds, so we need to have enough space in between them that we can easily work. Pictures on this page is our Unity Garden, our Life Enrichment Center, and it's a project they did to encourage vegetables being produced and shared right here in Marshall County. So they have different types of raised beds we'll talk about. I can take credit for the black ones, but I'll talk about them briefly later. Working with Sandy Reed, we went around to the garden courts in Marshall County and gave them an option of having some barrel raised beds to use. So when we're looking at container soils that is in smaller size containers, we probably want to use a soilless potting or garden medium, which needs to be replaced partially annually due to nutrients being provided by fertilizer. So when we're buying a potting soil, unless it's an organic one, it's going to have Osmocote in it, which is fertilizer in a pellet that slowly dissolves and releases those nutrients into the medium. So once we go through one growing season, there should be very little fertility left in that soil. So either the next growing season, if we don't replenish some of that and add some of that fertilizer back in, we're going to have to be using compost tea to be fertilizing it on a regular basis or another fertilizer because the medium will not have a nutrient-rich environment for that plant to grow. So you want to be thinking about that down the road if it's a container we're reusing, particularly if we have a perennial plant growing in that container, whether it's a lemon tree or a ficus plant. A perennial plant is going to need to be supplemented with fertilizer because the initial potting medium will become deficient in it. This is a recipe provided by HO 182, our raised bed container publication. You can take a half bushel of peat moss, mix it with a half a bushel of vermiculite. Possibly you can mix it with some perlite as well to aerate it to prevent it from compacting. We have to remember when we have container gardening, when we water, we're compacting the medium. And that's why we can't just use straight soil in smaller containers because they'll become compacted and not allow for good air and water exchange to occur. So after that, we add a half a cup of ground limestone to help with pH, half a cup of superphosphate, an important nutrient if we're trying to grow plants, especially blooms, and then a half a cup of a fertilizer, or like I said, Osmocote. I misspelled that, I'm sorry. Protected fertilizer that we put in there, so we do have a fertilizer source in this peat moss vermiculite mixture. So we can make our own if we want to. Most of the garden industry has gone away from making their own because they can purchase it easier than hiring the labor to do it themselves. So a raised bed, where it's a larger raised bed as these wooden raised beds are, or you possibly could do that even in these half 55-gallon barrels, is we can add some soil. Can't be all soil because of compaction again, but we can incorporate soil with organic matter and an aerator like a vermiculite to reduce compaction and grow our plants in this medium, which is going to have a source of nutrition from the soil that we added and that cation exchange capacity to hold on to nutrients as well. So I want to note here in this case, since we're using soil, we can introduce some pathogens, weed seed. So you may want to heat your soil. It's just heating it in your oven to 160, 170 degrees, just like a good heat in a compost pile to kill pathogens. It's a neat experience as long as your spouse isn't opposed to an earthy smell in the house, because it's going to have an earthy smell permeating your house while it's doing this. It's not going to hurt anything. It'll just give us a sense of going back to nature. But then we can use this a third bushel of loam soil, a third a bushel of organic matter, could be that peat, well-rotted manure, or your compost. So if you have a good compost pile going, that could be the source of the organic matter. And then we need that aerator material, whether it's vermiculite or perlite, and add in some fertilizer or some organic fertilizer to help enrich the soil for the initial planting. Off to the underneath the picture is what I call my greenhouse traditional mix. When I worked at Fred's Greenhouse in Napanee, Indiana, in high school, this was my job. So I'll never forget this mixture. Is 1 part loam soil, which I had the job of sterilizing, and we had a production field behind the greenhouse where we would harvest the loam soil. We'd have purchase organic soils. We have organic soils in northern Indiana, so that's an option to increase organic matter in our mixture. It's a soil that's at least 20% organic matter to be considered an organic soil. So we have like a Houghton muck here in Marshall County that is a organic soil that could beat that part. 1 part peat, so that was just baled peat moss that was on site, and then 1 part perlite or vermiculite. So that was a mixture that I, being the cheap labor, had the job of creating for the greenhouse, and it was used as a potting medium actually. So we used it in our producing our bedding plants and putting it into containers to grow plants in containers as well. So there's many sources of raised containers we can utilize. It can be a 55-gallon drum. It should be a food grade drum. And when we had our pickle factory here in Plymouth, it was kind of nice because we had access to food grade 55-gallon drum barrels, drums. And actually, that's where I got them to cut in half to give to the garden quartz, and also those that you saw in that previous picture. And they work pretty good. All you have to do is add drainage holes, which doesn't take long. And it makes a nice container that can be used in hardscapes or just by other gardening sites. We can, if not too tall, we can use like cinder blocks. That makes a good raised bed where you have holes in the cinder blocks that you can plant plants into. And then we can use treated lumber to create a raised bed. My counterpart in Stark and Pulaski County told me what we use to treat lumber now will not leach very far into a raised bed environment. So it's not as concerning as when we used to use dangerous chemicals to treat the lumber. So our treated lumber today is safer than what we used to have. We have lumber that's just naturally resistant. And we have livestock water troughs that can be utilized, galvanized metal sheets, which this wooden structure this picture of it's going to have galvanized sheets put on the sides of it. And then it's going to be placed over some patio stones to allow drainage to occur below it, or it could be on top of a soil as well. So be creative. Old pots and containers can be an option. Due to time, we'll move through companion garden. And that's just really an idea of creating biodiversity in a gardening space where we have multiple plants, that we have some plants that will help attract pollinators, some plants that will help with insect pest issues with some plants that they're growing with. And then we have productive plants producing items that we can harvest for our tables for us to eat. So this is just how to make a garden bed pretty productive. It's not just planting once and harvesting. We can use interplanting, succession planting, start with a spring crop, then go to a summer crop, and maybe even some of your beds work in a fall crop that can be covered with a low tunnel so it can extend the growing season. Relay planting is the same concept where we're starting something that's going to be harvested earlier, or even plant it beside where we're going to have another plant growing that takes longer. And in between the rows, we're growing something that we can harvest. Plant diversity is just building a plant neighborhood that benefits the plants by just having the diversity. Purdue research has demonstrated that if we have diversity in our beds, we're not going to have as many pest issues. And then we want to think about organize for plant productive, plant health, reduce pest problems, and our enjoyment. Having an attractive garden bed or interplanting food-producing plants among our perennial or annual flower plants is to our benefit. So when we're thinking about companion planting, we're thinking about botanical families because they have to be rotated. If we grow the same botanical plant in the same spot, that's going to create potentially even soil health issues for that family of plants. We want to think about how heavy a plant family feeds nutrients. So we want to have a plant that's harvesting more nutrients, followed up by a plant that may renew that garden space by being less of a nutrient removal family. Performance families, when we combine them, they help each other grow better. A good example is growing green beans in one row and then potatoes in another row. That reduces 2 beetle pests for both crops by having interplanted. And that would be another, in one family, a member may repel or lure pests away from another crop. So some herbs and flowers can perform this, and that's why we do that interplanting of different types of plants to not only create the biodiversity, but having some plants actually helping plants that we want to harvest to be more productive without having to use pesticides as often as we may. So you want to think about some families, it would be like asters, chicory, endive, cabbage families, brassicas, the carrot family, grass family, like sweet corn, legume family, beans, peas is what that other P was for, the legume family, onions, spinach, squash, and the tomato family. So the idea is we can interplant some of these families to create an environment that's more productive, mixing, a legume like green beans with a tomato family plant being potatoes is a relationship that is productive for both plants. And then working, but we want to not grow that. So if we grow that relationship, we don't want to plant tomatoes or peppers back into that spot the next year because we had potatoes. So we want to think about that for crop rotation. Already mentioned this, some are heavy feeders, moderate feeders, light feeders, and soil builders. So ideally you would do a soil builder probably ahead of planting a heavy feeder into that area so that you build the soil nutrient level before you're adding a heavy feeder, particularly if you're doing an organic system, so you can keep up. So the three sister garden is the classical one where you have a situation where you have a squash that's making it unattractive for raccoons to go harvest the ears of corn. You're doing a plant builder plant being a pole bean that is helping to enrich the soil while you're having a heavy feeder grow in the soil, which would be the corn and squash plant that's growing in that site. And then the corn plant is providing that pole bean a structure to vine on, so it's helping it as well. So something as simple as this is companion gardening, where we're thinking of how we're helping the soil to stay healthier by having a legume growing in it, protecting our ears of corn by having a squash growing in it that makes it less likely to have the ears stolen. So again, we're thinking about having I mentioned that already, repel or mixes up pests. A trap crop for Colorado potato beetles would be eggplants. And onions will help repel carrot rust, flies, for example. Another trap crop, actually, for many insects is smartweed. So if you know what smartweed is, I have had that in my garden space, and insects would actually feed upon it before the vegetables. So there's even some plants that we can grow in the area of our gardens that will be more attractive to feed upon than the crops that we are trying to grow. So this is just some examples of companion planting where we're intermixing different types of plants to have a more of a productive environment that's biodiverse to allow for less pest issues. And by rotating different crops through our beds, we can maintain our soil health better over time. And remember when I was talking about building our soils, we may even have one rotation where we're just growing a biodiversity of different types of cover crops in an environment to build that soil when we're not using it for food production. This is annual crops that's being demonstrated here, but companion planting can be done with perennial crops as well. So this is just an example of peppers, eggplants, tomatoes, straw flowers, parsley, coriander, and other flowers. So flowers can help repel some insect, attract some beneficial insect depending on the flowers that are planted. So it's a unique way that we can grow stuff, be productive. Currently, our master gardeners are doing a edible landscape front yard where they're looking to work with people living in Plymouth, Indiana to incorporate whether it's interplanting of plants that produce food with or other landscape plants in the front yard, looking at raised beds or container gardening or vertical gardening, where we're using structures for things to grow vertically instead of taking up a lot of space. So if you're interested in learning how to do that, you can contact the Marshall County Extension Office, and we can pair up a Marshall County Master Gardener to help you make gardening decisions in your landscape. So when we're interplanting, we want to be thinking about, we want the space to be fairly dense once the plants are mature to help reduce weed issues, but we don't want to steal the needed space from each plant. So as we lay them out and intermix them in a companion garden, we want to know the space each plant needs and give them that space when we plant them. So companion planting can be fun and productive. And thank you.